Hi, and welcome to the first lecture of the course Analysis of Social Interactions. My name is Nicola Peroni, Nico, and I will be teaching this course together with Isabel Robe. And because this is a digital program, we will teach this first block, essentially the first module or part of the content as a video. So I will be guiding you through the material. I will be making regular references to resources that I've also compiled for you, and it should be fun. Let's dive right in. We are inherently social animals. I have compiled on this slide examples of animal sociality. There are things you will recognize, of course, like demonstrations around global warming and typical displays of animal sociality, such as those made by chimpanzees, our closest cousins, or animals, so predators, cooperating to hunt. In fact, we have evolved to be social. Our ability to communicate, to interact, to cooperate, of course, is what has made us successful, is what has allowed our species to thrive, us and myriads of other species. And in fact, I was just talking about global warming, climate change, and in this time of imminent crisis, our sociality, our ability to interact, communicate, solve problems together is what might prevent our civilization from collapsing. Wow, that's a lot to start with. But essentially, now that we've established that sociality is so important for us humans as a species, comes the question, well, how do we study sociality? How do we study interactions? And in fact, this is the goal of this course. Together with you, over the next few weeks, we will look at how we analyze, how we describe, how we model social interactions. So we talk about interactions, right? In fact, interactions are data. Interactions are information. If you think about it, how can we collect data about our interactions? If we think of asking people, for example, we can have questionnaires, and this is in fact how social science was done for much of the 20th century and is still done nowadays. We can have automated measurements. I'm thinking of a famous study at the MIT Media Lab where students were equipped with Bluetooth, that was in 2005 I think, were equipped with Bluetooth phones, and researchers could track where they were going and especially who they were hanging out with. That was the first study of its kind. Or my own research, as I'll tell you in a second, I've worked on animals and humans in the past. I've worked on understanding societies, and much of the research that I've conducted together with other behavioral scientists was done by putting small devices on animals and on humans to understand where they were going and especially who they were interacting with. In addition to automated measurements, nowadays there's lots of data on online networks, social networks, right? Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, etc., etc. And in fact, I'm saying all this because the data that we can collect or simply crawl, scrape, we'll have a whole module on data scraping. The data that is collected about interactions can be mined, can be analyzed with analytical methods and numerical methods to uncover patterns. You might remember a few years ago the Arab Spring, when a wave of social unrest spread across northern Africa and led to the upheaval of different regimes. This revolution was called something like the first online revolution. Why? Because much of it, in fact, was orchestrated and planned online through social networks. And in fact, by following its dynamics on social media, like for example, the hashtags that led to the Egyptian revolution, it is possible to uncover exactly what led to the revolution, who were the main actors, what were the topics that were discussed, etc. What you see here is a network plot. You'll learn how to make this next lecture. Is a network plot showing the actors, I think, in a Twitter network of the Egyptian revolution. I'm showing this because the idea is that emergent phenomena, and I'll tell you more about emergence in a second, but emergent social phenomena, like social unrest, like a revolution, can be understood and predicted, in fact, from the structure and the dynamics of interactions. And interactions are what we need to understand at a microscopic level, at the individual level, to really understand the dynamics of the whole system and to predict if and when the system might undergo a huge transition, like in a case of a political regime change, for example. Since we're at it, I'd like to tell you a bit more about who I am and what led me to teach this course today. Originally, I'm an engineer. I was trained as an electrical engineer, working in real-time systems and robotics, in fact. But quickly I realized that that was about 12 years ago, I realized that I wanted to understand society. I wanted to understand how groups work, how they move about their environment, and how they make decisions. And this led me to the interesting topic of complexity, which is how things and individuals do things together and relate to each other to produce behaviors in large systems. I did research on this topic for a few years and then moved to data science. So I went from doing science with data to doing data science, and I was fortunate enough to pick up some knowledge in data science, so creating value from data, but also what I call data hacking, which is essentially putting things together so that they can work and you can get to a satisfactory result in a reasonable time. And that is something that we work on together in the project. And right now, I am focusing on modeling what I call complex human interactions through voice. In fact, the company I founded 2 years ago called Otto focuses on understanding emotions in voice. So we're really going into the core of what makes the richness of human interactions, which is our voice. But for the purpose of this course, we will stick to understanding interactions in a simpler sense. So interactions between individuals, be they animals or humans. I think most of you will want to work in humans. I'm sure many of you will want to work on online social networks. But the gist of it is that you can go quite far into studying interactions between individuals and understand how these form a coherent, complex social system. To start with, and before we dive into the math, or the more, say, formal description of networks and how to model interactions, I want to tell you a few things about applications of social network analysis and applications of social network modeling, also the analysis of social interactions. The first project I'd like to tell you about is actually a project I worked on here in Zurich. And I was working on wild house mice living in a barn in Ilmenau near Zurich. These mice were tagged with a small RFID chip that you can see here, essentially. And so every time they go through the entrance tube, that is the entrance and an exit of a nest box, every time they enter their house, essentially, their presence is logged. So this is raw data. It is just a recording of a small chip in an antenna, right? And a lot of processing is needed to make sense of it, to understand that the passing from the outside antenna to the inside antenna means that the animal is going from the outside to the inside, and then that if mouse 1 goes into a box and then mouse 2 goes into a box, then they are probably having a social interaction. What I'm saying is that there's a few layers of data processing, so data hacking, that go into understanding interactions. But once you have that, you can really form a social network. And what you can see here, in fact, is a network layout of the population of mice at a given time in 2011, I think, with, of course, females being pink and males being blue. And what you can see is that they are social structures. We call them communities, and we'll learn more about this in a lecture in a few weeks. But the idea is that we had a few hundred mice in this population, tracked them for 5 years, and extracted something like 50 million presence records, okay? From this, we understood who was staying where, and especially who was staying with whom. And this processing and this modeling allowed us to discover that there's a link between social centrality, something else that we'll learn about in a bit. So essentially how central an individual is in a network, and longevity. So the more connected, the stronger your friendships are, the more connected you are, the longer lived you are as a mouse. And if you think about it, it's fairly similar in humans. We combine methods from data mining and social network modeling to uncover and to study and model the structure of the whole population. I'm telling you about this example because first, I think it's pretty cool to understand that there's a link between how connected you are and how long you live, but also to illustrate the fact that you often go from messy data, a lot of messy, noisy, incomplete data, and you have to build your way up towards a cleaner representation of that data. And once you have clean data, you can then build networks. And we'll see this in the projects, and we'll see this in the exercises. So I'd say that for a project like this, and for a project like what you're going to work on in a later part of the course, the skills that you'll need are what I call data munging, so acquisition, scraping, querying, etc., and massaging of the data, and that really is 80% of the effort and 20% of network analysis. What you see right here in this video is in fact an animated network layout. It is a similar plot to what you see here in a static way, but on this plot we see different days. I think it's something like 2 weeks of interactions in this population, and overlaid are communities. I've talked about communities several times now. They're essentially cliques, strong groups that form in the network, and how to uncover them and what in fact they mean will be the topic of a whole lecture in a few weeks. There's a second study I'd like to talk about, again, to show you examples of what we can do with network analysis. And this is in fact also on animals, and this is also from my past research. And it's a study that focused on understanding how resilient social structure can be in bats. As you might know, many bat species are extremely social. They tend to hunt together, they tend to forage, so look for food together, and very often roost together, so sleep together, because they need the warmth. And I worked with a population of a few hundred bats that were also tagged with small chips that allowed us, very much like the mice, to understand where they were going, and especially when they were entering a nest box and who they were roosting with. So in this project, we also had to go from fine-grained, noisy presence records, so roosting records, bat sleep during the day, to a long-term social structure. What you see here are in fact diagrams, so histograms of the association index in two different populations. They were called BS and GB2. The association index quantifies how strongly two individuals are connected to each other. It is also the strength of their link, and that's something that we'll learn about very soon. And based on this, we created network layouts, essentially network representations that you see here. And what you can see is that the structure is strikingly different. The colony on the left, which is a small colony, has a network that resembles a random network. How random is a random network is another topic that we'll learn about very soon. But essentially, it's a structure that resembles a random network. The structure of the larger colony, in fact, is anything but random. It shows these two very strong clusters, very strong communities. And in fact, what we've uncovered, again, through dynamic social network analysis, was that this decomposition into communities was becoming stronger and stronger. Now, let us focus on the network layouts and network visualizations for this larger colony, so-called GB2. As you can see in the first video, from 2004 to 2010, essentially, the network was separating more and more into these two communities, to the point where around 2009, I think, the communities became so strongly connected within each other that there were no more strong links between the communities. We assessed that this was preliminary to colony split, so essentially the colony was in the process of splitting into two communities that were going to be two colonies. And this allowed us to make conclusions about the optimal group size for these species of bats. By the way, there's something called an optimal group size in humans, and it's estimated to be around 150 individuals. It's called a Dunbar number from Robert Dunbar, an anthropologist, but I'm digressing. And so, using network analysis, we estimated that there was an optimal group size for this species of around 18 individuals. Now, something really interesting happened. In the winter of 2010 to 2011, in fact, there was a population crash. It's not clear what happened, but the winter was very cold that year, and it's likely that during hibernation, many of the bats died. And as you can see in a second video, something like 2/3 of the individual didn't return the following year. They were not present in the population. We assumed that they died. The colony, if it had stayed split in these two communities, would in fact have died, because the communities then were too small to be self-sustainable, and the individuals, had they roosted together, would probably have died of the cold. But in fact, we established a link between simple individual rules at the individual level. So essentially, each bat only knows, we've showed this through simulations, models, and we'll also learn about network simulations a bit later in the course. But we've established that a rule as simple as know a few individuals as your friends and roost with them, so sleep with them a bit more often than with the others, essentially will create this population structure. And not only will create these two communities at a size that is large enough, but also if the size is not large enough, then the network will by itself revert to a random-like structure. And in fact, the structure of GB2, the large colony, after it had become small, is actually quite similar to the structure of the small colony. The bats don't know that this is happening. The bats don't make conscious decisions. They are social, but it doesn't mean that they're very intelligent. However, simple rules at the individual level allowed them to keep this cohesive and coherent social structure at the population level. And this is one thing, again, that we can identify through social network analysis and modeling. If you're interested to learn more about this topic, some of the slides I have a small magnifier icon, so essentially know more. And I've linked to a paper that was written on the topic, exactly on how we did social network analysis in this species, and also to a talk that I gave on social complexity that goes into more detail about how this works in bats and meerkats. Now let's move on. I hope I got your interest for real this time. I'm going to move on, again, still in examples. I'm going to move on from animals and into humans. I used to work with a brilliant social scientist and network scientist who was at Harvard and is now at Yale, called Nicholas Christakis. And I really admire his work, not only for the insights that he was able to get from interaction data, but also for the way he was presenting his work. And I decided to highlight two papers that were published in a New England Journal of Medicine about 10 years ago, that essentially show, also through social network analysis, that there are contagious behaviors in humans, such as obesity and smoking. Actually, I think this data is public, and this is something that you could work on in your projects were you to choose to. The data is extracted from the Framingham Heart Study, so it's a city called Framingham in Massachusetts, where 12,000 people in total were followed over more than 30 years. And they were given questionnaires. They were being asked regularly, how are you feeling? What do you do in your free time? Do you go running? Their body characteristics, such as weight, were measured, and also they had questions such as, are you a smoker? What do you eat, etc. Nicholas Christakis and his team were able to show through analysis, social network analysis of these data, were able to show some very interesting patterns, and especially that two behaviors spread across the network. We'll talk about homophily in a bit, so essentially that you tend to associate with people who are similar with you in behaviors, and this is something that can be found both for obesity and for smoking. It is something that might be apparent to you or might be obvious to you, but in fact, when you can show it quantitatively, it becomes really super interesting. There's something like, in the graph you see here, This is the social network of obesity in a first paper that I linked to in the resources. And yellow nodes in this network, yellow dots, are individuals who are obese, who have a BMI of something like more than 30, and green dots have a BMI of less than 25 or something. And what you can see is that these yellow and green dots tend to cluster together, tend to be close together in this network plot. This means essentially that friends tend to be similar in behavior and similar in eating behavior, and in this case, eating disorder. It is very much the same for smoking. You can see here that these are two snapshots of the Framingham study population in the 70s and in the early 2000s. And what is apparent from these two is, well, two things, in fact. First, there's less and less smoking in a population. Smoking decreased massively between the 70s and the 2000s, which is good overall for public health. But also that smokers tend to be friends with other smokers, and non-smokers friends with other non-smokers. In fact, Christakis and his team also estimated the chances of you being successful at quitting smoking if other friends quit smoking. And it's something like, if you have a close relative who stops smoking, your chances of yourself quitting are 20 to 30% higher. And behaviors, human behaviors, that we think come from our own free will, well, often are dictated by our environment, our social environment, our interactions with our environment. And in fact, you can show that behaviors spread through social ties. I hope you'll be interested, and if you want to know more, click through the links at the bottom of the slide. I've linked the obesity paper, I've linked the smoking paper, and I've linked another great talk on the hidden influence of social networks by Nicholas Christakis.